Here's a fun existential question to ponder at 11 a.m. on a Friday. How do you kill a god? At first glance, this might sound like an impossible thought experiment. Gods and immortality conceptually go hand in hand most of the time. Modern fantasy or urban fantasy stories will often world-build a paradigm where gods are utterly unkillable so long as they are believed in, and experience a slow diminishment into non-existence as their worship dries up. But that's very overcomplicated compared to the source material. Mythological gods die all the time all around the world. The problem is it just doesn't usually stick. A god who gets shot with mistletoe or ripped into pieces or dies in childbirth usually just gets some prophecy of resurrection or posts up in the local underworld and becomes a god of death. It's not like they stop being a god just because somebody murdered them. This does vary, and it's an easy mistake to lump together all mythologies into the same overarching paradigm as if they have anything in common beyond having at some point in history been a living religion somewhere in the world. In some pantheons, age and death seem pretty alien to the gods. The Greek gods don't really worry about either most of the time, and even getting ripped to pieces or eaten is just a minor inconvenience equated to imprisonment. Contrastingly, the Egyptian gods do have myths where they die, but very few where they stay dead. Most interestingly, they even have stories about gods getting old, usually Ra becoming aged and unfit for the throne to justify why the current pharaoh's favorite furry deserves a turn on the sunboat. But if there's one pantheon of gods that's widely known to be more killable than most, it's the Norse. Now, the Norse pantheon is also distinguished by the fact that pretty much every text we have about it was written after the Norse religion had been replaced by Christianity, and the Norse gods were no longer being actively worshipped. One of the most prominent sources for Norse mythology, and the source for today's myth, was Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda, written in Iceland in the early 1200s BCE, with a very intentional twist of nerfing the Norse gods. The prologue puts a lot of effort into coming up with an intricate explanation for how the supposed Norse gods were all actually great lords and ladies from Trojan War Troy, who the superstitious people of Western Europe foolishly took for gods, telling tall tales of mythologized exploits of these very normal human beings, Pope tested, Jesus approved. Thankfully, this is not a bit that Snorri commits to when it comes to the actual retelling of the myths in question, which are pretty clear on the gods being gods, but it does mean that almost every story we have from the Norse pantheon was being documented with the benefit of hindsight, and in many cases, an explicit effort on the part of the writer to humanize the gods. And it is interesting that one of the most famous myths in Norse mythology is how the gods all know that they are destined to perish horribly in the inescapable fires of Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. So evidence suggests that even before Christianization, the Norse gods were definitely not immortal. In fact, as we'll learn today, it turns out they're not even naturally ageless. So today let's talk about the time Loki nearly ruined everything. No, not that time. Not the big one either. Nearly is the operative word. Twilight is still a long ways off. It's only the tea time of the gods. Our story begins with Odin, Loki, and a dubiously relevant other guy trekking through the wilderness. In the interest of not starving to death, they snag a random ox and murder it into a healthy snack by way of an improvised oven. But when they check on the cooking progress, the meat is stubbornly unaffected by the flames. After confirming that it isn't a one-time thermodynamic fluke, it becomes clear that something is magically preventing their dinner from cooking. And that something turns out to be an eagle posted up on a nearby tree that demands a share of the meat before it'll let them roast it to perfection. The godly trio agree and quickly regret it when the eagle grabs all the best parts of the cow and horfs them down post-haste. Loki in particular is extra mad and whacks the errant raptor with a stick, which would probably work wonders on any ordinary bird but goes very badly with this magic one, because the stick gets stuck and the eagle flies off, dragging Loki behind it and steering him face first into every appealingly sharp rock or tree along the way. When Loki's bravado has been sufficiently rock-smacked out of him, the eagle quietly gives him the terms of his release. It'll stop knocking him around, but only on the condition that on a day of the eagle's choosing, Loki will lure the goddess Idun out of the safe confines of Asgard, along with her magical apples that are responsible for the Aesir's eternal youth. And Loki agrees. The eagle releases him and flies away, and the trio wrap up their journey and return home. And when the appointed day rolls around, Loki lures Idun out of Asgard with the claim that he's found apples growing in the wild that look just like her magic ones, and she should definitely bring them all with her to check. While she investigates, the eagle swoops down and abducts her, although by now Loki has realized its true identity. The eagle is nothing but a magical transformation taken on by the powerful Jotun Thjazi. Without Idun or her apples, the Aesir's immortality turns out to be highly conditional, and they all start aging rather alarmingly. The Aesir convene a meeting to try and figure out what the hell is happening and where Idun has vanished off to, and they quickly put together that the last time anyone saw her, she was leaving Asgard with Loki. Well, that'd do it. Loki is dragged before the Parliament of Gods and threatened with an assortment of creatively horrible fates until he's sufficiently terrified to agree to save the world again. He borrows Freya's feather cloak, takes the form of a falcon, and flies over to to Jotunheim for the rematch of the century that he desperately does not want to do. Lucky for Loki, Thjasse isn't home, and Idun is relatively unguarded, so he hastily transforms her and the precious apples of youth into a travel-sized nut and flies away as hard as he can. Regrettably, it's still not fast enough, as when Thjasse comes home from a hard day's fishing and finds his favorite hostage missing in action, he does what everybody in the Norse myths do and figures Loki did it. He goes back into eagle mode and tears off after Loki, kicking up a huge storm in his wake. Meanwhile in Asgard, the geriatric deities see, or more realistically hear, Loki panicking on the horizon, and set about figuring out how to save him from his terrifying pursuer. What they settle on is building a really big fire behind the walls of Asgard. With the superior mobility of a falcon, Loki drops to safety as soon as he clears the wall, but Thjasse's giant eagle form suffers the curse of all three of Newton's laws, and the momentum plows him headfirst into the flames. The Aesir all dogpile on while he's distracted by being on fire, and a glorious victory is won the only way the Norse gods know how. Gratuitous, heavy metal album cover levels of bloodshed. When the feathers finish flying, Idun is restored to her place among the gods, and thanks to her apples, everybody gets to be young and hot again, so the Aesir can really look and feel their best when they all die horribly in, like, a week? Maybe 2 if Loki needs a nap after that. Can't perish gloriously in an apocalyptic conflagration if you ain't cute.
Help me if you can, I'm feeling down, and I do appreciate you being round. Help me get my feet back on the ground. Oh, won't you please, please help me?